I'm Mike. Welcome to the first INC Chalk Talk of the semester. I'm very excited to introduce Paxon. I know Paxon Frady from the Redwood Center for Neuroscience at UC Berkeley. Before that, he was at Caltech for undergrad. And after that, he's been working in high dimensional computing and also neuromorphic computing at Intel. So I'm very excited to hear the neuroscience we'll be talking to us about today.
All right, thanks, Ed. I went to grad school here too, by the way.
Oh, I.
He's from Legion. I worked on Legion in UCSD. But I was in grad lab, yes. Yes. I know. Gosh. Okay. Well, anyway, yes. Thanks for having me, guys. And yeah, so I'm Paxon, and currently I'm at Intel, but I live in Georgia right now, actually, and still just cranking the crank with some neuromorphic computing stuff in Intel, but we're not going to really talk about Intel stuff today. It's just mostly going to be theoretical neuroscience that we've been doing at the Redwood Center. And the story I want to tell you about is really this idea of factorization and how I think it's like critical in our basic understanding of what perception is doing. Okay. Before I dive into it, though, I think it's worth maybe the high level talking about theoretical neuroscience and why it's so important, because there is this kind of divide between theoretical and experimental neuroscience. But unfortunately for experimental neuroscience, there's these fundamental problems that are out there that I think just will demand theory, and sort of without some theory, like there's these situations where we really just can't do things purely from the bottom up, which is like the kind of experimental thought. And so one of the problems is degeneracy. And so you can solve some problem in many different ways. And so, there's no one answer to any problem. And then there's also trade-offs. So like you might want to solve it this way or that way because it saves you energy or because it is lower latency. And so, there's no right answer. And also, what theory can help us do is really bring insights from the top down, right? So we can think about algorithms and behaviors and computations and sort of come at problems from the top down instead of this kind of bottom up approach that experimentalists typically take. So one example of degeneracy you can see in Eve Marder's work. So of course I worked on leeches, and this is another invertebrate nervous system here, but it's very simple. It's just like 20 or so neurons. And all it does is make two different rhythmic patterns. Basically, it helps the crab chew and swallow. And they've gone through and basically measured every parameter of every synapse, every channel, and tried to build the model. And so they actually measured them with experiments. And when they put their measurements, though, into a model, the model didn't work. However, then they explored the parameter space, and they found all sorts of configurations where the model does work, but the parameter regimes could be completely different. So here's two model networks, but the parameters that make up the model are just like completely different, right? And because you have to do these measurements in different animals, you're not really truly measuring the same system every time. And then because of degeneracy, the idea that you can just measure a bunch of things and put them together, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work. So I like to think about theoretical neuroscience as this ladder. And now that I've been working at Intel for a long time, I've come to understand the theoretical underpinnings of computer science pretty well. And I kind of am making this metaphor of like a computer architecture and how we have many different types of kind of fundamental ideas at different scales to Terry's very famous and important, insightful diagram about the nervous system and how it bridges over many, many scales. And in computer science, we have theory to take us up the ladder. And so the beginning might be Maxwell's equations, right? How do we go from some physics into some kind of math? But then, we use transistors, right? And transistors, they actually have a big linear part in the middle, but we don't use them that way. We use them like a switch in our computers, right? And so that's like a top-down engineering choice. and then, we have stuff like, how do you make logic gates? How do you make adders? How do you make multipliers? How do you make a microarchitecture? And so there are mathematical foundations to every step as you go up this ladder to build a computer. And in neuroscience, though, it feels like the ladder isn't really complete. And because the ladder isn't complete, it's hard to, again, bridge from the top down or really reach across these different fields. And it's interesting that like every field is kind of isolated in a way. Like as you go across different spatial scales, psychology isn't necessarily anything to do with neural circuits, right? And the literature is almost entirely different. And so I think the role of theory is really to help us fill out this ladder. And once we have that, we can now start to have these different fields communicate with each other. And so then, what we're trying to do is then make this more normative modeling for neuroscience idea. And really, we're kind of stuck in between this, how does the brain do it versus like, how can we get our computers to do some behavior? And where we have to go all the way down from physics to behavior. And the idea of normative modeling is then to use some aspects of degeneracy to kind of pull some algorithm that we know that works towards something that looks like the brain or something that might give us insight to neuroscience. And I would compare that to a computational model where it doesn't necessarily bridge from physics to behavior, but it sort of captures maybe some relationships across a couple of different scales, but it's sort of more of a description of what's happening. It doesn't necessarily capture an algorithmic behavior. So then to make a normative model, though, we need like a theoretical construct that bridges all the way from physics to behavior. And this is where we use BSAs and resonator networks to to basically start to make up some of these theories. But what I'd like to point out, though, is that, in theoretical neuroscience, you might be trying to make a point at this higher scale. Like, I'm trying to describe, say, a cognitive map and how the brain might be using a cognitive map for navigation. But for whatever reason, I implement it with, something that doesn't necessarily look biologically plausible. But, just because it doesn't necessarily fit at this scale doesn't mean there's not insights at this higher scale. And so I would just warn experimentalists to not dismiss theoretical neuroscience just because there's some mismatch at one of these scales, because there might be insights at a different one. I've been talking for like 4 days straight, but okay. So then, so what is the brain doing? So there is this very long-standing idea about analysis by synthesis, and so von Helmholtz described this in 1865, where essentially, it seems that there's some kind of generative model that is part of our perception, and you can see that in a basic illusion over there. And so if you just stare at that for a little while, it first might look like a staircase going up and to the left, but then your perception might flip and you might see it as the staircase kind of upside down and kind of going down to the right. And so the stimulus doesn't change, but of course your perception changes. And then the idea is that really the reason that this happens is because there are different configurations of a generative model that both explain the input. Yeah, great. Are you have a question?
Yes, if you block the left part, you see it. If you block the right part, you see it.
Well, I think if you just stare at it, it'll flip. It should just flip every now and then. There's an argument about how much you can control it flipping.
I wonder if it won't, because I'm looking up at it, so that's like breaking the symmetries.
That's good.
Yes.
Hard to give you.
Well, there's a whole literature about whether or not you can actually control which way you see it. And you can do some things to bias it, whether it flips or not, but it usually is kind of out of your control which way you see it. And it has like a 3 or 4 second kind of refresh rate. Okay, and so then I'm going to argue then that part of the analysis by synthesis is this idea of factorization, which we've heard of like in cryptography, right? Like integer factorization is part of cryptography. And that's essentially exactly what I'm talking about here, but just more broad than integers. And you can actually see in this also illusion that it does seem that the brain must be doing some type of factorization. So basically the illusion here is like, what's darker, the P or the R? 19-year-old, tell me. Okay. They're exactly the same, yes. And the reason that is because, well, it seems though that your brain is operating really on this reflectance image. So like when I ask you the question, you really want to tell me the properties of the surface, but the actual brightness is both the reflectance and the light, right? And if you just walk through the math about how surface interacts with light, you have to multiply the intensity of the light with the reflectance of the surface. And so then to get to the reflectance image and the luminance image, you actually have to factorize. And so the product of the reflectance and the illuminance gives you the original image. And so then there's another kind of thing in neuroscience called the binding problem. And we first need to start off with our basic understanding of connectionism and how we would represent symbolic entities with neurons. And this goes back to the beginning of 1965, where of course we would say like we have a neuron that represents a concept, and we have a neuron for every concept, right? And so we have a neuron for a triangle, we have a neuron for up, we have a neuron for square, we have a neuron for down. And so we can represent the left two things fine, but then we get to the right thing and we have up triangle and down square, or we have up square and down triangle. But in both cases, we would just turn all four of the neurons on, right? And so now we've lost the connection between the triangle is up and the square is down. And this is known as the binding problem. But there's actually a very simple answer. And Smolinski came up with this in the 90s, where basically, instead of just adding things together, you're going to take the outer product. And what that means is basically, you're going to make a neuron for every conjunction. So not only now you have an up triangle neuron as well as a down triangle neuron. And so you've had to expand your representation to actually represent every combination of features. And so that's what the tensor product does. And so you go from a vector to a matrix. But of course, the downside of that is that your dimensionality is expanding. And as you add more and more conjunctions, your dimensionality is going to grow and grow. And this is kind of a problem. But this is where this idea of vector symbolic architectures started. And essentially, the goal was to create a binding operation that can represent conjunctions without the dimensionality growing. And the way they figured out how to do this was by taking advantage of the properties of randomized vectors. And so basically, in a high dimensional vector space, when you want to represent some kind of symbol, you represent them with orthogonal vectors.
No, I don't think so.
Look at the bottom left, the audio mic. No, but that's from the back.
Yeah.
It's okay. No.
Am I muted? It doesn't say I'm muted here.
Okay.
Yeah. Can somebody online say something? Is your audio working?
I can hear you. Yeah, we can hear you.
Did you have a question, Bert?
Let's go.
Okay. Okay, yeah, so then basically, yeah, so when you use vectors to represent symbolic entities, the idea is like orthogonal to vectors are representing symbols. And you can tell if there's a symbol or not because you do the dot product. And the dot product of orthogonal vectors is 0, right? But there's only n orthogonal vectors in an n-dimensional space. So you can only represent n things. But if you use random vectors, and high dimensional random vectors, their dot product is extremely close to 0, very likely, but there's an exponentially large number of them in an n-dimensional space. And so we can actually take advantage of this to make a conjunction operation. And so basically then they developed this idea of a binding operation, which in this case, you can see it as you just pick random vectors of +1s and -1 for any symbol you want to represent. And then when you want to represent a conjunction, you multiply them element-wise, okay? And you can show that like the statistics of the conjunction are also looks like it's random. And so it also has the quasi-orthogonal property. And so then basically then you can use conjunctions, this binding operation to represent conjunctions, but there is this price of noise that you have to pay. And the other thing about VSAs, oh yeah, sure.
Sorry, can you kind of help connect that part with the outer product? Because now it's a element-wise distribution, not a product.
That's right. And I actually have an entire paper about this. And so there's a paper called variable binding with sparse distributed representations where essentially, okay, so there's also all these flavors of VSA. So this bipolar one is just one version, and the binding is the element-wise multiplication. But then there's other versions where the binding is like a convolution. And then it turns out that actually every binding operation is a reduction of the outer product. Essentially, it's a compression of the outer product. And so like the Hadamard product is just take the diagonal of the outer product. And the circular convolution is like sum up these diagonal terms of the outer product. And so it turns out that every binding operation is related to the outer product, and they're like compressions of it. But you can do this with different types of random vectors and different types of binding operations. But geometrically, essentially, they're all the same. They're sort of like orthogonal, and then you bind them and you get a new orthogonal thing.
All right, quick question. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Are there like nonlinear binding operations you can perform that are not like reductions of the outer product?
Well, the binding operation is a multiplication, so it's not linear.
Okay. I mean, okay. But like, are there any operations you can perform that are like not basically something that you can do to the outer product to achieve the binding operation?
So in the paper, yeah, basically there's two types of similarity structures that evoke binding versus what we call bundling. So bundling is add and binding is multiply, basically. And as long as binding distributes and it has the orthogonal properties, yes. But it's usually, yeah, just some kind of function of the outer product.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
I mean, here it's just element-wise multiply. So like I have a vector of +1s and -1s, I just element-wise multiply them, get another vector of +1s and -1s. The Hadamard product of vectors is a binding operation here. So you take two vectors, bind them, you get a different vector. Element-wise multiply. Yeah.
Each component.
I mean, it's like an inner product that you don't sum. You don't do the sum. It's element-wise multiply, right? And then you just have a vector, right? If you summed it, then you would have the dot product, but I just have the vector, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and the other big aspect of VSA is actually this algebraic formalism, right? And so now that we have both a binding operation and a bundling operation, or add or superposition, we call it, we can actually then create data structures inside of vectors and then manipulate the data structures like it's almost conventional computer programming. And so basically like there's a vector S that I like to think of as a RAM, and then X, Y, and Z, you can think of as like pointers, and then A, B, and C are like the values attached to the pointers. And so you can like dereference this and search these data structures, and you can use the algebra to also then create different types of data structures all inside of vectors. So then one thing though we come to often is this situation where we are stuck with a vector like B, and we know that it's the product of some X, Y, and Z, but we don't know specifically which X, which Y, or which Z, but we know that it's one of, say, 100 potential X's in this codebook X. So the big X is like a big matrix of random vectors. And one of those vectors is the X in our B. So the question is like, what is X, Y, and Z if we're given B and we're given the code books? And what we used to have to do would be to enumerate every combination of X, Y, and Z, and then compare that to B to see which one it is. And so we would have to like enumerate 1 million combinations of different vectors and do the dot product to solve this problem. But we discovered an iterative solution that can help us without needing to enumerate all the 1 million combinations. So in a little bit more simple idea is like S equals X times Y. So if we knew X, then it'd be easy to get Y. We can just unbind X from Y. But since we don't know X or Y, that's why it becomes a challenge. And so the result is like what we call search and superposition. And so in VSAs, what we can do is this thing we call superposition and put a bunch of things on top of each other all at once. And so the idea is we can put every possible guess for X in as a vector all at once by just adding them all together. And just, so now we added all the X's together. So this is our superposition guess for every possible X. And now we can just infer Y. So we use the guesses in X to infer Y by unbinding X from S. But since we have so many things in superposition, the result is going to be extremely noisy. So more superposition is more noise. But then what we do is clean it up. So we have the code books, and we basically force the answer to be in the span of the code books. Yes.
Y is the same dimension of the
Yeah, X and Y are both like 1,000 dimensional vectors.
is the same dimension in both cases.
Yes.
Yeah, because you define them
Why would they be different?
because you define it in different way. The X and the Y.
Yeah, they could be different.
Well, you have to, this Hadamard product is an element-wise operation. So like the dimensionality all has to match for this S equals X times Y.
Don't have to be much.
They have to match, yeah. Yeah, so you pick N is a, you pick that, but usually some high dimensional number like 1,000 or 10,000. And then the D there is like 100. And then, so we have 100 X's and 100 possible Y's. And so that would give us 10,000 combinations to search over. But we're looking at 1,000 dimensional vectors.
So
Okay.
when you say you put in a superposition of X's, are you literally summing up, just adding these?
Literally just adding them
S?
together, yes.
Okay, cool, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, and then we then explored this kind of capacity. So this has a limitation, essentially, but basically the resonator network will solve the problem basically every single time as long as the combinatorics is less than what we call the operational capacity. Okay, so if this M max is the operational capacity, this is like how many combinations are in the problem, right? So here's 10 to the 6, like that's our 1 million combinations. And then that means that we need, something like, almost 2,000 neurons in these vectors to solve this 1 million combination problem. And so if we make the vectors bigger and bigger, we can solve larger and larger combinatorics problems. But of course, we're doing more computation too. So then it turns out that the resonator network is a tensor factorization algorithm, and it's useful to talk about it this way as well. And so if we think about a tensor factorization, the idea is very similar to matrix factorization, like doing PCA, but we're just going to extend this to tensors and higher order tensors. And so then the idea is that we have like eigenvectors and eigenvalues. But now our tensor is going to be broken up into the outer product of 3 vectors. So U, V, and W are just vectors. And when you outer product them, you get like a tensor cube, right? And then you're going to weight that cube by the eigenvalue. And then you're going to sum a bunch of those cubes up, right? And so that is essentially how you factorize a tensor. And we can then solve the tensor factorization problem using a resonator network by doing the following. So
What is tensor? What you say? What is the tensor?
The tensor is this capital lambda here.
This is the only value because you ask the only vector and then you get the vector.
Now, this is the outer product. This is a tensor product of vectors. So we tensor product vectors to make a tensor.
The product is the vector.
Here, this symbol is a tensor product, right? This is the outer product. Okay, so that means we go vector to matrix, and then we go matrix to tensor. Okay, right? And so big lambda is a tensor, right? So it's like 100 by 100 by 100, or no, it's 50 by 50 by 50. Okay, and then we can encode this into a VSA vector like as follows. So we take every point in the tensor, we give it, we make a random vector for U, a random vector for V, a random vector for W. So there's 50 each, since the tensor is 50 wide. And then we bind them all together to represent like a single point in the tensor. And then we weight it by the actual value of the tensor. Okay. So like this is a picture of a tensor kind of. It's just like a projection on one direction, but the color of the dot is kind of like where it is in depth. And so like this tensor is made out of outer products of vectors like this that are basically 0 and very sparse, right? There's 2 sparse vectors, outer product them, makes up this tensor. And then we stick the tensor, or we convert the tensor into a VSA vector like this, and then we stick this into the resonator network, okay? So then the resonator network now has 3 modules that estimate this little u, little v, and little w. And so these are the eigenvectors. And so what happens then is as time goes forward, time is going down, and the resonator network starts off with this random guess, right? And there's lots of noise at first. And so the first few iterations, you see all this like chaos and noise. And so it's bouncing around very chaotically in this state space. And then at about iteration 5 here, it hones in on solution and very rapidly has like a moment of insight. And then all the modules converge simultaneously. And then you can see then that these yellow peaks. And so this is just like a heat map of the vector that it thinks is the eigenvectors. And so you can just read out then these 3 vectors, and that corresponds to the UR, VR, and WR.
So, yeah, that's interesting. But there is, in addition to converging to request low-dimensional or sparse patterns, there seems to be inversion of the polarity, especially in the bottom phase, right? Around.
Yes.
Right?
Well, yes.
So it's
right.
Flips from black to yellow.
Well, there's a perfect ambiguity as well, because you can always flip the eigenvectors. That's it's just one of the things about tensor factorization in general is that there's not really unique solutions.
Same like RCA.
Yes, I mean exactly, and it gets even more like less unique in tensors. And so yeah, but one of the degeneracies is that you can just do a negative sign and 2 of them.
How change the node is
Sorry.
the network is node. Why is the necessity that the resonator to get this code?
What is resonating?
Okay. Yeah. This is a resonator network. This is right. So this is just that, these are high dimensional vectors that you bind, right? And these are just matrices that you do dot products with. And then there's like maybe a normalization function here. And so it's just like a recurrent neural network with a multiplicative operation inside of it as well. And there's conventional tensor factorization algorithms that also can do tensor factorization.
So is it resonates when the eigenvalues are closely imaginary?
Well, what I call resonating is this process of just like going from this chaos to a solution, right? It's like you go from this chaotic search into this, positive feedback cycle that resonates.
Steve Rosberg.
Yeah, it is kind of, yeah.
Depends on the begin with the chaos, initial chaos, and then you get close to the solution, what kind of solution you want to get, because, you know.
Well, you want to get these eigenvectors. Yeah, I mean, well, you want to get this decomposition into vectors. You want to turn the tensor into 3 small vectors, right? And so do you have a question?
Yeah, my question is more like, I see that you have in the lambda that you have R factors.
Right.
What do you mean by VR? You could.
Yeah, I mean, basically, like the idea is just like in PCA, you know, you have the sum of some set of eigenvectors, and you know, usually you can chop it off at some point, and that would be like a R. But it's just like saying that there's some set of them, and I don't necessarily know what R is, but it's just more generic. And so for each, so in this case, the R is 3, so there's 3 sets of eigenvectors, and so this first box is just one iteration, right? So we solved it, and it found only one set of the eigenvectors, right? So this is just one set of eigenvectors. Then what we do is explain this away. So we make the tensor again and subtract it from the original tensor, right? So there's a residual now. And then we do it again on the residual, and then we can pull out the next set of eigenvectors. And this
each row there, so the first row is the first part, and then you get the residual, and the second row is the
second R,
and so on.
and so on.
And you could have done this with 9 instead.
Yeah, and then you just keep going, yeah. And so then you can either, so eventually you'll get to the point where the residuals are so small that the resonator won't be able to find anything, and it'll just be noisy and stay noisy forever. And so then you might need some kind of heuristic to tell you to stop, but yeah, you just keep going.
Do you have theoretical guarantees for converting?
This is the guarantee, right? So it's not theoretical, but it's empirical. But as long as it's under the operational capacity, it'll pretty much solve it.
What did the numbers mean on the titles of the people?
Oh, yeah, that actually just is saying which one is the largest peak, because usually I use it symbolically, but there's multiple peaks, so just ignore that for now.
So in your last picture, there's like a black bar, like a low activity point before it becomes like yellow,
right,
and highly resonates. What is that black area?
Again, yeah, that's like related to what Gert just asked. And yeah, there is this degeneracy of like the vectors can, like if 2 vectors, they can both flip to negative and cancel out their flips, right? But the reason in this, I have something that says it has to be positive in the logic of the loop. So it might actually just flip the sign in the next step.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
In all the cases, we have
yeah, yeah. So then each one of these is a set of eigenvectors, right? And so now I have R3. Well, R is 3 basically, and then each one of is a set of eigenvectors that makes up the tensor.
There's in tensor space.
Well, yeah, they're tensor eigenvectors, yes, but yeah.
But also, you see, in the one that's symbol 21, do you have 2 eigenvalues there?
No, the vector just has 2 peaks.
Vector.
It's just a vector with 2 peaks.
I see.
Like down in the left.
I see.
So like when I made the tensor, I just made random sparse vectors with 2 and 3 and 2, right? And then I outer product them to make this tensor with dots, right? And then I get the vectors back, right? Okay, and then, all right, so now there's one more thing we need to do before we even get to the nature papers, but here then we have this thing we call the exponentiation trick, or what we call fractional binding. And now I've converted to this complex valued VSA, but it's very similar, but the idea is like every element in a vector is a random complex number with unit phase, but unit magnitude, but random phase. And still the binding operation is just to multiply element wise, okay? And so you're just multiplying these phasors. And so that just means that the phase spins. And so you can just, if you do the same thing times itself, you can think of it as v squared. And if you do this in complex numbers, you can actually put a fractional power in this exponent. And what that does is creates an encoding of a manifold. And basically it induces a similarity kernel that represents the manifold. And essentially then points that are close together on the manifold have high similarity. And then, it falls off to 0 basically. And in this paper, we describe all sorts of ways you can shape this kernel. And there's also all sorts of ways you can make different types of structures like circles and toruses. And this was like going on in the Redwood Center for a long time, and even describing the 90s. But I would point out that this is actually exactly the same as this Rahimi and Recht paper, which is the underlying logic of these position encodings and transformers. So it's very similar to transformer position encoding, but we use it to represent smooth manifolds. And so then we can think about an image as a function on a two-dimensional manifold. And we can then use this VSA vectors to represent the image. And essentially, we're going to just find a pixel. So let's say 40 by 25. And we're going to take a random vector h, raise it to the 25, take our v, raise it to the 40, multiply them together. And that's a VSA vector for this pixel. And since this pixel is white, it has a weight of 1. And so then this is 1, right? So we're just summing up the pixels, multiplying by these code bits to get a vector.
25 and 40 there?
It's like the position of the pixel, like the position in the image, right? And the point is now that we can use the binding operation, so we can translate the image by delta x or delta y by forming these translation vectors and then binding these to the s. And what you can see is it distributes and essentially gets absorbed. And then if we decode this, we see the image translated. And then here I've also done another trick where I've made it circular manifold in both directions. And so that way the pixels will wrap around the image as well. Okay.
And this is the same as what you're saying.
Well, I mean, we've extended it, right? So, I mean, yeah, if to make it a manifold, you have to, I mean, to make it a circle, you have to sample the random distribution in a different way. And it's all about how you sample this random distribution to get different properties.
P1 is the base of something. And the element of the P1.
Yeah, so every, when you pick V, right, I pick a V at random. So every phi1 is a random phase. And then I'm essentially multiplying the random phase by this continuous number x. And so that's just, and so every element is just going to be spinning at different rates based on its random phase. So all these little phasors are just spinning around as you increase x.
But you don't have the change phase because you know that after one loop, have to change to 5.
Well, it's a complex number, right? So it's just it's a complex number. So it doesn't have that problem.
But imaginary numbers, they will happen.
It's a complex number. It has imaginary part. Okay, so then now we can do this visual scene understanding task. And so then what we're doing here is now using what we've done in VSA to create a generative model of a scene. And the generative model basically is saying, I have some shape, it's located in some horizontal position and some vertical position, and it's colored a certain color, right? And that constitutes one of the objects. And then there's another object, some shape in a different position with a different color, some shape in a different position with another color, right? But this is the generative model. This is not what we're given. What we're given is the scene, okay? We are just given the pixels, right? But we use the generative model to help us solve the inverse problem. We want to go from the pixels to the parameters of the generative model. And that means factorizing the vector. And so this is then how we do the resonator network. And so each one of the factors then gets a resonator module that estimates each factor. So here's like what the module looks like, basically. And essentially it's going to get the input and it's going to get estimates from all the other factors coming in. It's going to use those estimates to infer the value for shape. And then it's going to use its code book to clean up the value and then broadcast out its estimate for the shape. And then each of these modules then gets hooked up into this recurrent neural network structure. And the animation should be playing. And so then you can see then the dynamics of the resonator converging to different solutions here. So basically it's just initialized randomly, you see it bounce around for a little bit in this chaotic phase, and then it converges. And then once it converges, you take out that particular factor or that particular object, reconstruct it, subtract it from the scene, and then restart the process. And
do the objects have to be separated physically? Like if they do overlap or they do any confusion?
let me get back to that. Okay, so just one issue here is that the templates, I have correlations, but the eigenvectors cannot have correlations. They need to be decorrelated. And so the simple solution for that is just to whiten the templates. And so we basically just do PCA whitening here. And now instead of storing the original templates, we're storing these whitened templates in this cleanup module. Okay, and then we can take the idea into rotation and scaling. So now I can make a generative model where the idea is the scene is just a letter, it's centered, but it can be arbitrarily rotated and arbitrarily scaled. And our solution is very simple. You just project that into log polar space. And now translation in log polar space is rotation and scaling. And so we can just build this translation resonator again, but we just have this projection into log polar space first. And we can solve the rotation and scaling problem the same way. But of course, there now brings up a situation that comes up a lot now. There's perfect ambiguities because of symmetries, right? Rotation is a free parameter. And so we can't tell if this letter is a B or a Q. And so now symmetry is suddenly a really important thing to consider. Okay, so then we can make a generative model now that has both rotation and scaling, as well as translation and color. And so we need to think of then the generative model where one object, it starts off in the log polar space, some shape times some scaling times some rotation, and it gets converted into Cartesian space and then translated and colored. And then the scene is composed of several such objects. And so there's this log polar transform in the middle. And so then when we want to figure out what a resonator module is supposed to do, we essentially solve for one of these terms. And so we solve for C, and there's all these cross terms that we just kind of ignore. But then we can get a solution like this, do that for every single one of the factors, and you can solve the resonator network solution. But in this case, what turns out is you get the same term repeated over and over. And it also just coincidentally looks like its own resonator module. And so again, it has this shape of you're going to bind a couple of things together, and then you're going to multiply by this big matrix. And so it's kind of like a new set of modules that emerge from these repeated terms. And so this then gives us this structure, which has a more hierarchical structure. And so each module then is hooked up according to how we solve this inverse process. But then we have these bridge modules, which help us convert from Cartesian into log polar space and convert back from log polar space into Cartesian space. And then again, you can see then the dynamics of the resonator on the right converging to the different solutions.
You can only detect one shape at a time?
Well, it's intentionally like that because the properties that it extracts are bound together. And so you can't, if you try to detect more than one thing, the properties which belongs to which thing would start to get confused. But what you can also do is just put the resonators in parallel. And so like we also have in the paper where we just make them in parallel. So we have several of them just in parallel, and they are all constantly explaining away as well. And so they kind of compete for their chunk of the factorization, and they run simultaneously then.
And then you don't have to repeat it for like each one.
Yeah, but then then they would all just converge whenever they want to. Yeah, you wouldn't repeat it. But then yes, this brings up a lot of new challenges, and also there's a lot of times where it finds these like weird solutions that aren't super intuitive. And so part of the reason that this happens is because there are assumptions in the generative model that I haven't explicitly told the resonator network, namely that the factors are like one hot. So it's like one object, one position, one color. But it's not necessarily true that that has to be the case. Sometimes you can have, several hot, or like the eigenvectors I showed you earlier weren't one hot. And so like to kind of induce it to be one hot, we've also been adding some sparsity kind of promoting features to the dynamics. And so that tends to help a little bit, but sometimes you get these weird answers that, they don't make sense intuitively from a high level, but in terms of like explaining the pixels and solving the factorization problem, they actually do a good job. But it's like all these weird random mixtures. Yeah, and then we use this to basically solve this visual odometry task. And essentially then now we have a camera, it's just moving around. And now we're just treating the scene like it's a single object, basically. And we're internally generating a map of the environment that's basically static. And then the resonator is trying to figure out how does the current view of the camera fit onto the map? And then solving that problem tells you the orientation of the camera. And so like as we, then what we can do is just use the visual inputs of the camera to tell how it's moving in space. And this gives us like a really accurate odometry because it's almost pixel level resolution. And then another approach we've been exploring is to generalize the patterns. And so what I described in the Nature Machine Intelligence papers are just static fixed templates. Yeah.
You consider the other action time or what to do?
All right.
You know that is changing in time.
Yeah, this changes in time. So like there's basically the resonator network dynamics are happening on a much faster time scale. And so it's basically, so you can think about this line as the resonator dynamics over time, but it's basically, it knows the solution. And since like frame by frame, it's not changing too quickly, it's locked in on the motion. But if there's like a sudden radical jump in the motion, you'll go through again this phase of random chaos as it tries to figure out the alignment again, and then it will lock back in.
The calculation is in each frame.
Basically, the calculation is in each frame, yes. I mean, it kind of is, but like, I mean, the resonator network, once it's locked in, it's using its previous guess as its next guess. And so it stays locked in because it doesn't change that much frame to frame. But if it does change like suddenly, then it will lose its tracking. And so it will have to go back through this chaotic phase where it realigns the tracking, and then it'll just stay locked in again.
What kind of filter do you use to guess the next?
It really is just, it's not even doing anything special. It's just, the guess is where it is right now. It's just saying where it is the guess.
So it's moving in time and then bring it to when it comes to.
I know it moves in time, but like the resonator is just going to be like, I think it's this, but the dynamics are going to then resonate out and it's going to correct itself, right? And then, yeah, but you could start to add momentum and things like that as factors, and then start to build a generative model that has momentum and start then to make predictions and stuff. But we didn't even need to do that here. It's basically aligning each frame onto the map.
So I'd like to see if I understand that GIF that you showed on the last slide. So are you basically just feeding in the yellow portion in the middle picture with a black background, and then it's guessing where like all of the rest of the things, including the stuff that you gave it, are. So that's why you can see the outline outside of the box of input. It's basically telling you where things are that aren't not in sight anymore.
Yeah, well, the red thing is the thing on the right, which is the map.
Mhm.
But it's just then like the inverse of the camera transformation is applied to the map to align the camera, the map to the camera in this animation, basically. And so, yeah, so you see
Okay.
the map goes outside the box because the maps is like this internal memory of the environment. But of course, the box, the green stuff is the actual camera, yeah.
I see. So it's kind of keeping track of like the translation in
Yeah,
effect.
yeah, it's
Okay.
keeping track of the translation and the rotation.
All right, thanks.
Yes, and then, yeah, so then we are now trying to do it so that we can have objects with a little bit more variability, right? So like everything else was fixed templates, just like fonts from letters from a font. And here it's like MNIST digits. But then the difference is instead of like storing fixed patterns in this pattern module, what we're going to store is a sparse basis set of MNIST features, okay? So I basically took the MNIST training set and did PCA ICA to get a sparse code. And so that gives you these features here, which look like little number features. And so then when you want to reconstruct an image, it's then the weighted sum of these sparse codes. And the weights are what are extracted here out of the resonator network, right? So like now we're not thinking about this symbolically, we're thinking about this as a sparse code of an image. And then when we want to reconstruct the image, we multiply the sparse code with these basis functions. And so then like basically now the resonator network is going to factor out the color and the location of this object. And if we look then at the object module, we have a centered MNIST digit. And so we can just then use a simple classifier to classify the MNIST digit. But the resonator has automatically taken care of us translation invariance and color invariance. So this is just some speculation about this that I was inspired a little bit by Doris Sal's work, where if you look at the brain, you sort of see these basis functions that are specialized for different classes. And there's also then generic basis functions as well. And so like, we could think of like how I did this thing for MNIST, we make these basis functions that are specialized for a particular class of objects. And so perhaps there are higher order brain regions that have basis function for particular classes. And so like, if you look at different face regions, it seems to be the case that there's certain brain regions that are sensitive to frontal faces, certain brain regions sensitive to profiles. And so the idea is that maybe there's something similar going on to like what I'm describing. Well, we're also trying to then bring a lot of these ideas into neuroscience. And so we've been using a lot of this ideas about these two-dimensional manifolds and images as well to help us represent space and think about the hippocampus, which is involved in navigation. And there's a couple of other things that help us bring it to neuroscience. I've been talking about these complex valued vectors, but I also have a paper which describes how you can compute these complex valued representations with spike timing codes. So basically we can use biophysical spiking neural networks to do all these computations. And there's another version of VSA that's sparse. So everything so far has been dense, but in the brain, it's usually, not that many neurons are firing simultaneously. But there's a VSA that's also sparse, and so we can also capture that. And then, we can kind of go beyond the biomimicry because we have now a way to represent complex numbers with spikes, and it also uses oscillations. And in the neuroscience of the hippocampus, there's this really prominent theta oscillation. And so this is like, you stick your electrode in there, you hear the spikes, but then you also hear this background oscillation. And it turns out that spikes are locked in relation to this background oscillation. And that's also similar to how the spike timing code works. And then you also see that, of course, these cells have place fields. And so this is a mouse running around the box. And every time a neuron in the hippocampus spikes, they draw a little red dot. And so then they see that this neuron is sensitive to this region in space and encodes. And it's sort of like the idea is that the hippocampus is encoding a map of space. And so we're going to use the VFA techniques to also encode this map of space and then build it up to something that can solve some navigation task. But basically, like if we just take our simple model and kind of do the spike timing code, do the sparse VSA, throw a mouse in a box and let it run around, then we can generate a neuroscience recording basically, right? And so this is just like all these things put together, the map, the spike timing code, sparse VSA, and then it's like we recorded the neurons and they spike relative to this background oscillation. And they even do things like phase precession and create place fields.
How to create the spike time?
So the timing of the spike relative to background oscillation is the phase of the complex number.
And the background oscillation, how do you time it? Like,
That's just like a locked signal.
just like a data.
Yeah, there's just like something generating a data cycle, yeah.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah, and so then we're trying to build up something to actually try to solve a navigation problem. And the kind of speculative idea we have right now is really inspired by this Taylor and Deschena idea of the hippocampus, that really the place fields and the neural code of the hippocampus is an index pattern that helps you associate something like from the sensory cortex to your representation of space. And so here the idea is kind of like, okay, I want to make this map of space and I want to store visual landmarks inside of this map by linking vision to this hippocampus place code in these synaptic weights. But of course, we have place, but if we're going to link position to vision, it very much matters like which way we're facing. And so I've extended the hippocampus encoding to also add head direction. And so now, instead of just locating single point in space, it's encoding a conjunction of its direction it's facing and its location. And so that way, like that gives you a unique code for that particular view that's coming from your sensor stream. And so then the idea is you would link these hippocampus representations to the visual information in some kind of synaptic matrix through some kind of learning process. And then you could build up this map which contains all these visual landmarks inside the hippocampus, and then use these VSA operations to query this data structure and hopefully solve some kind of visually guided navigation problem.
In this case, you get some input, right, about the image. You do processing with the vector, and then how you get the response? What is the decision of the animal?
I mean, this is really just a speculative model still. Okay, this is just, it's just about right now. I'm just kind of talking about this idea that maybe there's a data structure like this in the hippocampus, and there's a lot of details about how you would go about being embodied and building this data structure out, and it gets very complicated. But this is more of a high-level kind of speculation about it. But if the hippocampus, if you think that vision is linked to the hippocampus somehow, like, maybe the hippocampus does need to represent something more sophisticated than just place, like this conjunction of place and view. But yeah, exactly how this becomes a navigation algorithm, it's also going to depend a lot on using the resonator network to help us solve some of these problems. And so you can imagine, like, you can set up a problem where, like, going from my current location in space to some other location would have to, like, essentially factorize a path that takes us from here to there. But like, I'm not there yet, but this is just speculation. And then my other collaborator, Chris, has been writing a lot of really interesting papers about grid cells. So there's another part of the brain that represents space, but instead of place cells, they have this grid-like patterns. And so we've been exploring also how you can make grids with these VSA representations. And so here's some cool papers about that. Grid cells are located in the entorhinal cortex. And so that's usually thought of as the primary input to the hippocampus. And yes, and then last kind of speculation, well, last few, I guess, yeah. It's just like, how do we kind of start to bring this towards 3D graphics? And I think really the holy grail is to solve inverse graphics and to solve the shape from shading problem. And I think this approach is a way to do it. There's hope, but the issue is it gets significantly more complicated when you go to 3D, because you have to like start to account for the light sources and the camera, as well as the objects being positioned. And then there's occlusion starts to occur, and you need to encode all these extra things like surface norms and reflectance properties. And so, we've gone, like we had a 2.5D representation with rotation and scaling. So we had 6 factors. But to go to 3D, it's like we need 24 factors all of a sudden or more. And so it's a lot more complicated, but yeah, maybe there's some hope. And yeah, and then there's just a general question about learning. And I showed some idea of learning with the sparse basics functions, but right now we just translation invariance and rotation and scaling was something that I just programmed in essentially. But Ube was looking at how you can learn these things. And but it requires kind of assumptions that don't go into the standard learning paradigm, right? And so it's basically impossible to learn a manifold structure from this supervised learning paradigm where you're just independently given random kind of input and output samples. But rather, to do this, you really need the manifold assumption. And so you need video data, basically, that like things are on the manifold and they don't change that much frame to frame. And so with that assumption, you can kind of find these manifolds. But then there's another question of like, what about this larger graph? Like, what about all these different modules? And like, when do I add a module? When do I add a higher level module? And this architectural learning is just, I think, a completely open question. Yeah, but then that's kind of the whole book now. Okay.
Bruno there, but I'm feeling.
There's Bruno.
So how is this resonator stuff conditioned how you're thinking about neuromorphic stuff?
Well, I mean, yeah. So yeah, we of course like have this neuromorphic chip as well. So I'm at Intel working on Loihi, which is a neuromorphic spiking chip. And yes, the resonator is one of the algorithms we're trying to get to work and on the chip. And I had this dream of doing it all with like the spike timing code and using the complex numbers on the chip, but like just the chip can send out like a continuous, it sends out and it's a spike actually a 8-bit number, and so it's not truly binary. And so then like I could just directly compute on these numbers instead of trying to use the spike timing. It's just more efficient to do it that way on the chip. But yeah, but we're trying to make the resonator network work on the chip. There's just like a couple little, implementation issues, but.
I was curious if you tried to stand on more complex objects like faces and dimensions and regions and multiple shapes. And if you thought, there would be the ability to address some more complex.
Right. Well, I think the idea though would be like you need to think about the generative model, and so what are you trying to solve exactly with you know, looking at faces. I mean, so I could make this scene analysis with faces and just put faces in different places and do the exact same thing, and it would probably work just fine. But you know, like, you know, what are you actually trying to do with faces? Probably, you know, recognize someone, and so you probably really want to think more like, actually, the face is this conjunction of like these properties of like your eye distance and these features that, you know, distinguish your face. And so then the idea would be like, you know, the pixels you get is some product of these generative factors that help you, that really are what you need to distinguish people's faces. And so then like you would create some generative model and then use a resonator network to invert it. And then like you could potentially use the factorization to help you identify someone.
Do you have any notion of the back? Like, when you were, you had the Eiffel Tower there. So you, I tried to listen, like, you're saying like that we want to use this for navigation, and you're trying to do like what exactly would be the problem? Like you would use like I go to just beneath the below the Eiffel Tower, and then the
Right.
agent would go there. Is there some notion of that? Like I don't know.
Well, there's like multiple phases, and like one of the ideas is kind of like as the mouse is just moving around, like it's building up a map, and it's very analogous to this, and but just kind of in a, you know, more broader, you know, three-dimensional sense. But we have like we're slowly building up this map, and we have this map inside of our head somewhere, and then like once we have some kind of notion of the map, we can then start to query it using these BSA vectors. But we'll need like this logical, like higher order executive function to query the map and as we desire, you know, but basically like, yeah, you know, as we go around and navigate, like the resonator network, the visual odometry is sort of building up the map. And then when we want to use the map, there's some sort of process of querying it.
So I'm still forming the question in my head a little bit, but going back to the face and the maps kind of a little bit. So let's say you have a rat and it's running on like a Picasso painting. So it's making a map of something which it sees like eyes, nose, and all the stuff. It's in random order, but for it to know that hey, I'm actually walking on a face, it needs to also put those things together.
Right.
So do you think, I don't know, does the resonator network then maybe somehow route information that, oh, I see two eyes, so maybe it's a face, or, like the question is more like if the objects are there, but their spatial orientations and distances are different than something that you maybe learned, how would you map?
Well, I guess like, you know, a map like this is just like a pixel-based map, right? Yeah. And so it doesn't really extract these high-level things like nose and eyes, right? It's just the raw features mapped onto the current view of where the mouse is or the rat. And so in that case, like it's just going to be the pixels. Yeah. It's not going to like think about this high-level stuff.
So I guess my question was, you show on one of your slides, there was like a little 4, and then you could see that the eigenvector corresponding to red was high, and then something corresponding to like a feature like 4 was high. So I was trying to just relate to that. If we could just build little modules that individually kind of parse these parts together.
Well, right.
Higher level, it just
yeah. I mean, so like yeah, it's exactly like here. It's just there's a sparse code that represents the features, but we haven't classified it here. But you could, I mean, but we build another layer to classify it, and then so then we can go from like this. So this is like, you know, 160 dimensional feature space to 10 classes, right? And so that's just like a neural network layer.
Sounds like a lot with variational autoencoders. I don't know.
Well, the variational autoencoders are trying to do this disentangling, but they're not like approaching it like a factorization problem.
All right, quick question.
Yeah.
So actually I have two questions. So the first one is, if I gave this a picture like some of those that you gave where you have multiple objects in different positions,
Yeah.
would it be able to, would a group of these things be able to pull out each object individually and
Right.
their location without being
Yes.
told that there are multiple objects or their locations?
Right. Yeah. So yes, this works with multiple objects in the scene. And so again, like it's just gonna, kind of randomly hone in on one object and factorize just that particular object. And so you would
Okay.
either need to reset it or have parallel running to get that next object.
Oh, okay. Okay, great. But it will hone in on one object. And then the second question
Right.
is it scale invariant to like the size of the objects? Or how would you build that in if
Well,
if
no,
it's not
yeah.
currently?
Well, we have, this is, it's in this part of the generative model, in this more complicated one, where
Okay.
we can scale it, we can add scale as a factor by adding this hierarchical layer in this log polar space, basically. And so, yeah, so then it can become a scale invariant, but I didn't do it
Okay.
that.
And there's no data training or anything necessary, basically. Like the way it's
Right.
built,
The
I'd
only
automatically
kind
can.
of training is just the like either the sparse coding or like some kind of decorrelation. Yeah. But that's pretty much
Okay.
I mean, it wouldn't even, it's so trivial. It's like, it's hard to call it training or learning. It's, PCA basically.
Well, this is great though, because this is very impressive. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much.
Nice.
Percent.